Hello everyone, welcome my channel, please subscribe my channel. My hands went numb so fast the porcelain dinner plate nearly shot out of my grip and shattered across the black rubber mat at my feet. The kitchen behind the halcyon ballroom smelled like bleach, burnt butter and expensive beef, and the fluorescent light over the prep sink painted every stainless steel surface a hard surgical white. Victoria Whitmore stood in the service doorway in a cream silk gown with one manicured hand pressed to her collarbone and the other pointed straight at me, her diamond bracelet flashing like a warning signal. Two security guards were already moving in. Chef Luis froze with a towel over his shoulder. The event manager stopped mid-step, clutching a clipboard to his chest. And Daniel, my former husband, appeared behind his mother with that same controlled expression he used to wear in depositions, as if the whole scene had been rehearsed down to the angle of his jaw. "There she is," Victoria said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the rattle of dish racks and the hum of the industrial washer. "I knew it. I knew you'd crawl back." The air left my lungs like I'd been punched, but my face stayed still. One of the guards grabbed my elbow. "Ma'am, step away from the station. My name is Evelyn Hartwell. I'm 35. And this is the story of how I went from a convicted felon scrubbing banquet plates in a hotel basement to the woman who dismantled the family that buried me alive." Daniel took one measured step closer, adjusting the cuff of his charcoal tuxedo as if this were a minor inconvenience instead of a public execution. He looked exactly the way he had the day I was sentenced, expensive, composed and careful not to seem too pleased. Victoria's lipstick was the same cold berry shade she wore at charity galas and funerals. On her left, the event manager, Colin Reeves, kept licking his lower lip and shifting his weight from heel to heel. On her right, one of the younger servers had both hands clasped over her mouth. Nobody spoke for a second. Then Victoria lifted her wrist. "My bracelet was on the dessert table 10 minutes ago," she snapped. "Now it's gone." And this woman was seen near the guest corridor. I looked at the bracelet already glittering on her wrist and almost smiled. Chef Luis frowned. "Mrs. Whitmore, with respect, your bracelet." "Not this one," she cut in. "The emerald line bracelet. My husband gave it to me in Geneva. It was in my bag." Daniel's eyes slid to my apron pocket, then to the locker room door. A tiny movement. Easy to miss. I remembered once loving those details about him. The way he never telegraphed panic. The way every lie came dressed as reason. The older security guard tightened his grip. "We'll need to search her locker." Victoria took another step into the room, satin shoes clicking over the concrete like a metronome. "Do it. She's a thief, and if anyone here had bothered to look her up before hiring her, you'd know she's also a criminal." A murmur moved through the doorway behind them. A few gala guests had drifted close enough to hear. Civilian donors. Junior officers. Two women from Victoria's Foundation with champagne flutes caught halfway to their lips. Public enough for humiliation. Controlled enough for damage. Daniel finally spoke. "Evelyn," he said low and polished, "don't make this uglier than it needs to be." The young server at the door looked from him to me with wide, frightened eyes, and I could practically feel the story taking shape inside her head. Fallen woman. Desperate woman. Convict woman. The kind of woman people look at with pity until someone important gives them permission not to. I had been out of prison for 92 days. In those 92 days, I had learned how quickly people glanced at your left hand for a wedding ring before deciding whether to trust you, how they looked at your resume for gaps and your background check for sins, how they smiled when they rejected you so they could still feel decent afterward. I had filled out 63 applications. I had been turned away from office jobs, warehouse jobs, call center jobs, and a receptionist position at a dental practice where the owner had actually said, "You seem so articulate. This is just unfortunate." Washing dishes at the Halcyon Grand had been the first steady work I could get. It was also the only place in Washington where the Whitmore Veterans Foundation happened to be hosting its annual Legacy of Service Gala. That was not an accident. Daniel leaned toward the guard. "Search the locker. Now." I met his eyes and said evenly, "You still rush people when you're scared." His expression tightened just for a second. Victoria gave a short, humorless laugh. "Scared. Listen to her. She's delusional," Colin Reeves added too quickly. Sweat had gathered at his hairline, and the clipboard in his hand trembled against his tuxedo jacket. I turned my head toward him. "You should loosen your collar, Colin. You're blotching." That silence that followed was absolute. Colin touched his neck without thinking. Daniel's gaze snapped to him. Tiny fracture. First crack. Then a voice behind the cluster of bodies said, "Move." It wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. People stepped aside with the reflexive obedience certain men spend decades collecting. General Adrian Vale came into view from the ballroom side, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, wearing dress blues so dark they looked almost black under the fluorescent spill from the kitchen. His chest carried rows of ribbons, but it was his face I watched. He'd been talking moments earlier to donors under crystal chandeliers and amber uplighting. Now he stood at the threshold between polished ceremony and dishwater steam, his hands still half-curled around a glass of mineral water, and stared at me as if someone had opened a grave in front of him. The color drained out of him. "Oh my God," he said. His fingers loosened. The glass slipped, hit the tile, and burst apart. "It's her." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I could hear the dish machine cycling behind me, the heavy swish and hiss of hot water and detergent, and somewhere deeper in the kitchen a pan clanged to the floor. Victoria turned sharply. "General Vale, you know this woman?" He didn't answer her. He just kept looking at me, his mouth slightly open, like he was seeing a ghost in a gray apron and non-slip shoes. Daniel recovered first. He always did. "General," he said smoothly, "this is an unfortunate staffing issue. Evelyn Hartwell used to be my wife. Used to be. As if marriage had been a lease that expired." Vale's eyes shifted to Daniel, and what I saw there wasn't surprise. It was recognition with history attached to it. Memory. Fear. Calculation landing all at once. "You said she took a plea," Vale said, voice rougher than I remembered. Daniel's posture changed by less than an inch. "She did. I folded the dish towel once and set it beside the sink. Then I peeled off my yellow gloves, finger by finger, and laid them on top of the towel with deliberate care." Victoria made an impatient sound. "I don't care who knows whom. My bracelet is missing." I finally looked at her. "No, it isn't." Her chin lifted. "Excuse me. It isn't missing," I said calmly. "It's in the false bottom of your silver Judith Lieber bag, wrapped in a white monogrammed napkin from the Bourbon station, because your assistant Denise put it there 13 minutes ago after Colin here told her the kitchen cameras don't cover the service hall outside the pastry freezer." Colin went so still he looked pinned to the air. The younger guard's grip on my elbow eased. Victoria blinked once. "That is absurd." "Is it?" Daniel's voice hardened. "Enough." I reached into my apron pocket, not fast, not slow, and pulled out my phone. Both guards tensed. "You can take that if you want," I said. "But before you do, you should probably know the audio has already been uploaded." General Vale closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. I unlocked the screen and turned it outward. On it was a paused video from 20 minutes earlier. The service corridor outside the prep kitchen, reflected not from a ceiling camera but from the polished steel face of the dessert freezer door I had angled carefully before my shift. Denise Whitmore, Victoria's assistant, appeared in profile. Colin stepped into frame beside her. Daniel entered a moment later, his back to camera but unmistakable in that tuxedo. The sound was thin but clear enough. "She won't make it past security," Colin whispered. Daniel said, "Good. As soon as my mother identifies the bracelet missing, it's over." The young server made a tiny choking noise. Victoria's hand flew to her chest again. "This is fabricated." I tapped the screen once. The video continued. Denise opened the beaded evening bag, wrapped something in a napkin, tucked it into the hidden compartment, then snapped it shut. Daniel said very quietly, "When she reaches for her locker, make sure they all see it." Nobody said anything. I let the implications settle over the room. Then I opened a second file. Stills. Time stamps. Enlarged frames. A message thread between Colin and Denise arranging the correction. A screenshot of the public gala staffing roster. Another of the temp agency request I had submitted 3 weeks earlier for this exact event. No improvisation. No panic. Just pieces. Victoria's nostrils flared. "You planned this?" "Yes," I said. Daniel stepped toward me, fury finally slipping through the seams. "You set us up." "No," I replied evenly. "I came to work. You did what you always do when you see me standing upright." General Vale sank onto a prep stool as if his knees had quietly failed him. The metal legs screeched against the tile. He stared at the phone, then at Daniel, then back at me. His face looked older under the light. Not weaker. Just suddenly unable to hide how much he knew. The older guard cleared his throat. Sir, ma'am, I think maybe we should. Actually, I said, and everyone looked at me. What you should do is ask why a decorated general thought I was supposed to be dead to this room. Daniel's jaw flexed. Evelyn. I slid the phone back into my apron. You don't get to use my first name like we're on the same side of history. Victoria's voice pitched higher. You ungrateful little. Careful, I said quietly. She stopped. I had spent 3 years and 2 months in Alderson Federal Correctional Institution because the Whitmores needed a body to stand between their defense contracts and the truth. They told the world I'd falsified compliance records, leaked protected procurement files, and moved money through a subcontractor account. Daniel testified that he had begged me to get help. Victoria cried in the second row. General Vale signed a statement saying he'd trusted my work until he discovered irregularities that threatened national security. The papers called me brilliant, unstable, and dangerous in whichever order suited the paragraph. By the time I was sentenced, every version of me worth believing in had been professionally cremated. Prison stripped life down to things you could count. Days. Steps. Pills handed through slots. The number of women who cried in the dark. The number who didn't. I learned how to read legal filings the way other people read weather. I learned that innocence and proof were cousins, not twins. I learned patience from women who had none of the privileges I'd mistaken for permanence. And I learned that the people who frame you never expect you to get quieter. They expect tears, rage, sloppy desperation. They do not expect discipline. The first month after my release, I rented a room over a laundromat in Alexandria from a widow named Mrs. Donnelly who didn't ask questions as long as the rent arrived in cash, and I kept my shoes off her hallway runner. The second month, I started getting up at 4:30 every morning to send applications. The third month, I saw a society page item online about the Whitmore legacy of service gala returning to the Halcyon Grand, with General Adrian Vale as guest of honor. I stared at that article until the tea in my chipped mug went cold. Then I smiled. Because General Vale had only looked like a man seeing a ghost if he believed ghosts had something to say. The older guard released my arm entirely. Colin Reeves took a step backward and hit a wire shelving rack hard enough to rattle stacked ramekins. Denise was nowhere in sight. Smart woman. Daniel glanced toward the service exit, already calculating distance, optics, containment. I spoke before he could move. I wouldn't leave if I were you. Not yet. Is that a threat? Victoria said. No. It's advice. Daniel's eyes narrowed. What do you want? I watched him for a moment. He still had the face that had once convinced me silence could be intimacy. Strong mouth. Controlled brow. Hands that looked gentle until you noticed how often they positioned other people without asking. I want you to stay exactly where you are, I said, until your phone rings. He laughed once, but there was no ease in it. You're bluffing. General Vale finally found his voice. She isn't. Victoria turned to him, scandalized. Adrian. He didn't take his eyes off me. What did you send? I held his gaze. The same thing I sent 4 years ago. Only this time it went to people who read attachments. Then Daniel's phone buzzed. He didn't move at first. Nobody did. The vibration seemed indecently loud in that bright kitchen. Then it buzzed again. He pulled it from his pocket, looked at the screen, and all the blood left his face so quickly it was almost elegant. Victoria whispered, Daniel? He answered. Yes. I watched him listen. No, he said after a moment. That's impossible. He listened again. His eyes cut toward me. Who else got it? He asked. One more pause. Then very softly, I see. He ended the call. His hand was shaking. He tucked the phone away with visible effort. Victoria's voice came out thin. Well. Daniel swallowed. The Department of Justice served Whitmore Aerodyne with a preservation order 10 minutes ago. Colin made a strangled sound. General Vale stood too quickly, then braced one hand against the steel counter. The younger guards stared at me as if I had changed shape in front of her. I folded my apron strings loose and untied them. There it is. Victoria's lips parted. You vindictive little monster. I hung the apron over the sink handle. No. Vindictive would have been easier. Daniel took a step toward me. You think this changes anything? I met him halfway with my eyes. It changes who gets searched first. He stopped. I picked up my coat from the hook by the staff door. Plain black wool. Thrift store. Still damp at one cuff from the rain outside. Then I looked at General Vale. I'll be at Bell, Sloan and Mercer at 9 tomorrow morning, I said. If you want a chance to correct the part of history you signed, be there before your lawyer tells you not to. Vale's throat worked. Evelyn. I shook my head once. Not here. Then I turned to Daniel. Tell your mother to check the bag. Victoria actually opened it before anyone could stop her. Her hands, always so precise, fumbled the clasp. She dug through lipstick, compact, card case, silk scarf and then found the false bottom. When she lifted out the white napkin and the emerald bracelet spilled into her palm, a sound moved through the doorway behind her like cold wind through dry leaves. Nobody looked at me with pity anymore. I stepped around the broken glass from General Vale's dropped drink and walked straight through the service corridor, past the mirrored bronze wall panels and the floral arrangements in silver urns, into the dim back elevator where the fluorescent glare softened to a low amber wash. My pulse was steady. My hands were dry. Below the lobby music and the ballroom applause, I could hear my own breathing, slow and even. They thought they had cornered a disgraced woman in a dish pit. They had no idea I had taken that job for the uniform list, the access map, and the chance to watch exactly which faces went pale when I walked back into the light. The next morning the conference room at Bell, Sloan and Mercer smelled faintly of leather, coffee and rain drying on wool coats. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked K Street in a sheet of silver daylight, and the long walnut table held neat rows of legal pads, water glasses, and folders aligned with such precision it felt ceremonial. Authority lives in texture as much as in titles. The polished wood. The weight of the chairs. The hush that tells people this is a room where outcomes get written down. I arrived at 8:43. Naomi Bell was already there. She stood at the far end of the room in a slate suit with a white silk blouse and half-moon glasses balanced low on her nose, one hand wrapped around a ceramic mug that said "Trial is my cardio" in faded black lettering. Naomi had spent 15 years in Army JAG before building the kind of private practice people hired when they needed their disasters translated into strategy. She was 51, sharp as wire and allergic to self-pity. 3 weeks after my release, when every legal aid clinic I contacted gave me a sympathy script and a waiting list, Naomi read my first email and called me in 17 minutes. Not because she believed every convicted woman who wrote her. Because attached to my email had been 37 pages of chain of custody inconsistencies, cross-reference testimony excerpts, and a single note that read, "If I'm wrong, tell me where." He told me where I wasn't. Now she nodded once as I entered. "You slept. A little. That's enough." On the table in front of my seat sat a slim black folder and a glass of water. Naomi believed in staging. Not theatrics. Staging. There's a difference. At 8:52 Celeste Navarro walked in. The first time I had seen Celeste for years earlier, she was wearing a fitted ivory dress at a donor dinner in Georgetown and laughing at something Daniel said with one hand on his sleeve, too familiar by half a second if you knew where to look. She had been his executive operations director then. Efficient. Beautiful. The kind of woman older board members called impressive, because it sounded safer than dangerous. Now she wore a navy sheath dress, her hair pulled back low, no jewelry except a flat gold watch, and carried a banker's box with both hands. She met my eyes carefully, like someone approaching a bridge she wasn't sure she deserved to cross. "Morning," she said. "Morning," I replied. That was the first full conversation we'd had in person. Naomi took the box from her and set it near the projector. "You brought everything." Celeste exhaled. 3 external drives, printed transfers, archived Slack exports, and the original vehicle failure reports. Good. At 8:59 the first of the others arrived. Daniel came in with 2 lawyers from Archer Payne, both in dark suits and expressions of cultivated disdain. Victoria followed in pearl gray with her own counsel, shoulders stiff, lips compressed into an almost regal line. Edward Whitmore, Daniel's father and the family patriarch, entered next with the careful tread of a man who had always assumed rooms would open for him. He had built his reputation chairing veterans' boards, sitting on defense advisory panels, and giving interviews about sacrifice in a voice smooth as polished stone. He was not a senator. He didn't need elected office. Influence had always fit him better without the inconvenience of voting. General Adrian Vale arrived 2 minutes late with civilian counsel and the look of a man who had not slept at all. In Act 1 of my life he had sat above me in systems reviews and praised my precision. In Act 2 he had signed the document that ended my career. Now his uniform was gone. He wore a dark suit, no medals, no symbols, just the tired posture of someone who had finally learned that plain clothes do not make accountability less visible. Everyone took their seats. The Whitmores chose one side of the table automatically, an old family formation. Daniel in the middle. Victoria to his right. Edward at the head, fingers steepled. General Vale sat slightly apart with his lawyer, which told me more than anything he might have said. Naomi remained standing. "Thank you for coming," she said. "This meeting is being held pursuant to pre-litigation disclosure discussions related to wrongful conviction, evidence fabrication, conspiracy, procurement fraud, obstruction, retaliatory prosecution and civil damages. You were each given notice. You are each represented. We'll proceed accordingly." Victoria let out a brittle laugh. What we received was extortion theater from a disgraced ex-convict. Naomi didn't blink. "Mrs. Whitmore, if you interrupt again before I finish my opening summary, I'll ask the court reporter to mark your outburst as Exhibit 1. Victoria's jaw snapped shut. Yes, there was a court reporter. Young man. Gray tie. Compact machine. Already typing. Naomi pressed a remote. The screen at the end of the room lit up with a title page in plain black text. Hartwell Matter. Timeline of Coordinated Retaliation and Fraud. Daniel leaned back in his chair, but I saw the pulse beating at his throat. Edward adjusted his cufflinks. Vale removed his glasses and polished them with unnecessary care. Naomi began. On March 11, 2022, Ms. Evelyn Hartwell, then Director of Compliance Review at Whitmore Aerodyne Systems, flagged irregular density readings in ceramic composite armor plating supplied under Army Vehicle Contract WA-4471. Her internal memo recommended immediate suspension of shipments pending metallurgical retesting. The screen changed to my memo. My name. My signature. My caution notes highlighted in yellow. I remembered writing it in my old office with the late afternoon sun turning the glass wall bronze and the smell of printer toner hanging in the air. I remembered believing that if you documented facts carefully enough, institutions would protect themselves from corruption because self-preservation was stronger than greed. I had been wrong about which kind of greed. Naomi continued. On March 12, Daniel Whitmore forwarded that memo to Edward Whitmore, Victoria Whitmore, and General Adrian Vale from a private email account not preserved in company litigation holds. Subject line, "We have a problem." Daniel went still. One of his attorneys said, "Where did you get that?" Naomi ignored him. On March 14, Whitmore Aerodyne's outside lab report was altered to remove the fail code on 2 tested plate lots. We have the original report and the altered version. Ms. Navarro. Celeste stood, opened the banker's box and passed down 2 stapled packets. She moved with steady hands, but her face had gone pale around the mouth. "My credentials were used to request the altered PDF," she said. "Not by me. By Mr. Whitmore from my terminal after business hours." Daniel gave her a look so cold it would have wilted weaker people. He held it and kept going. "I know that because he asked me to leave my laptop unlocked while we were in the executive lounge that evening. At the time I thought he was just trying to finish slides for the board. Later I checked the server audit logs." Victoria turned toward Daniel sharply. "You said she knew." Celeste's mouth thinned. "No, Mrs. Whitmore. He said I was convenient. There was." First fracture. Naomi clicked again. A timeline appeared, each date a dark bar descending the screen with clinical certainty. March 11th. Evelyn Hartwell flags failure. March 12th. Memo forwarded privately. March 14th. Lab report altered. March 17th. Dinner at the Willard, private room reservation, attendees Edward Whitmore, Daniel Whitmore, General Adrian Vale. March 18th. Evidence package created on Evelyn Hartwell's work laptop. Timestamp 11:43 p.m. March 20th. Anonymous tip submitted to military investigators from burner phone purchased in Arlington. March 23rd. Internal suspension. April 2nd. Public statement issued. June 7th. Plea negotiation begins. The room felt smaller with every line. Naomi rested both palms lightly on the table. This is what premeditation looks like when wealthy people mistake emails for invisibility. Edward finally spoke. His voice was deep, controlled, and faintly paternal, as if everyone present were inconveniencing him by taking facts personally. This proves nothing about conspiracy. It proves sequence. Sequence is not guilt. Naomi nodded. Correct. Which is why we also have bank wires. Another screen. A shell consulting company in Delaware. Quarterly transfers. One of them to Colin Reeves, the event manager at the Halcyon. Another to Denise Fallon, Victoria's assistant. A third to a private investigator retained during my criminal case. Daniel's lawyer sat forward. Objection to characterization. Naomi almost smiled. This isn't court, Mr. Kessler. You don't get to object to arithmetic. A sound escaped me that might have been a breath or a laugh. Daniel heard it and looked at me. For 1 second the mask slipped, and I saw the man who had stood in our marble kitchen years ago with a hand around a whiskey glass, telling me I needed to stop being so doctrinaire about procurement variance because real life is messier than compliance manuals. He used to say it like he was offering sophistication. What he meant was that he'd already chosen profit over principle and wanted me to feel childish for noticing. Naomi turned to Vale. General, the meeting at the Willard on March 17th. Vale set his glasses down carefully. I've amended my prior statement. Yes, you have. Please summarize for the room. His lawyer leaned in. Adrian. Vale lifted a hand. It trembled slightly before he steadied it against the table. At that meeting, Edward Whitmore told me a hold on W4471 would create political fallout and supply disruption. Daniel Whitmore stated Ms. Hartwell had become emotionally unstable and was overreaching beyond her lane. I was told there were unrelated irregularities under review concerning her access behavior. My face remained still. Inside, something old and sharp turned once. Naomi asked, "Did you believe that?" Vale looked at me before answering. I wanted to. Exactly. That was the engine of it. Not just greed. Convenience. My ruin had been administratively useful. Naomi pressed. Did anyone at that dinner ask whether Ms. Hartwell's memo was correct? Silence. General. No, he said. Edward gave a low scoffing exhale. Adrian, for God's sake. Vale swung toward him with more force than I'd seen from him yet. You told me if I kept the matter quiet until post-award review, nobody would get hurt. The room changed temperature. Celeste closed her eyes briefly. Naomi did not miss a beat. Nobody except the convoy in Diyala province 3 months later. The screen changed again. A classified incident summary, heavily redacted but legible where it mattered. Vehicle breach. Non-conforming armor failure. 2 fatalities. 3 severe injuries. Nobody at the Whitmore side of the table moved. Celeste spoke before Naomi could. Her voice was softer now, but it carried. My brother Mateo was in the follow-on unit. He helped pull them out. That landed differently. Not as law. As blood. Daniel stared at her. You never told me that. She gave him a look so flat it was almost merciful. You never asked me a question that wasn't about you. Second fracture. Naomi let the silence sit long enough to become a weight. Then she resumed with deliberate calm, moving 1 point at a time the way surgeons expose damage. Now we come to the evidence package created on Ms. Hartwell's laptop, she said. The package used as leverage in the plea that ultimately sent her to prison. A forensic image appeared. File tree, timestamps, device IDs. The government's theory was that Ms. Hartwell moved protected procurement documents to an unauthorized drive and manipulated subcontractor invoices for personal gain. In fact, the protected documents were uploaded remotely from within Daniel Whitmore's office suite using Ms. Navarro's credentials. The subcontractor invoices were rerouted through Meridian Response Solutions, a shell entity controlled by Edward Whitmore's longtime fixer Lawrence Pike. Here are the transfer logs. Here is the metadata. Here is the recovered deletion history. Daniel's lawyer actually swore under his breath. Edward leaned back slowly, the leather chair creaking under him. For the first time he looked less like a patriarch and more like an old man who had mistaken habit for invulnerability. Victoria snapped. Daniel, say something. He didn't look at her. I'm thinking. I finally spoke. You always did your worst work in a hurry. His head turned toward me. You think this makes you righteous? No, I said. It makes me documented. That hit him harder. Naomi nodded once toward the folder at my seat. I opened it. Inside were copies of my prison records, denied appeal notices, parole conditions, employment rejections, psychiatric evaluations ordered during plea negotiations, and photographs of the room I rented above the laundromat. Not for sentiment. For damages. For scale. Naomi addressed the room. Let's be plain. Ms. Hartwell accepted a plea under conditions shaped by fabricated digital evidence, manipulated professional testimony, reputational coercion, and the credible threat that contesting the case would trigger national security charges based on records she did not move. She lost her career, liberty, home, health, and standing. Some of that can be compensated. Some of it cannot. Victoria's mouth curled. She still took the plea. I looked at her, then at the reporter's machine, quietly stuttering every word into permanence. Yes, I said. Because your son put documents on my laptop and your family made sure every man with a uniform preferred a convenient confession to an embarrassing truth. Victoria's face flushed a violent red. Daniel leaned forward, hands flat on the table. What exactly do you want, Evelyn? There was again. Not apology. Terms. Naomi answered before I could. Full cooperation with federal investigators. Signed admissions of evidence fabrication and retaliatory conduct where applicable. Support for a motion to vacate the conviction. Financial settlement. Public correction of the procurement record. And, depending on the department's election, criminal referrals. Edward's lip curled. This is fantasy. Naomi slid a second packet toward him. No. This is your choice set. He didn't touch it. So I did what I had come there to do. I reached for my water, took one slow sip and set the glass down carefully on its coaster. Deliberate slowness. Every eye stayed on my hand. Do you know why I took the dishwashing job? I asked. Nobody answered. I wanted you to see me, I said. Not in court filings. Not in a photo from 4 years ago. I wanted you to see what your decisions looked like standing under fluorescent light with cracked hands and a prison record. I wanted you to look at the human cost before the lawyers made it abstract. Daniel's composure frayed at last. You engineered that entire scene. I made sure you'd find exactly what I wanted you to find. Vale let out a slow breath and pressed the heels of his palms into his eyes. Celeste stared at the tabletop. Edward's nostrils flared. Victoria whispered almost to herself, "This is obscene." Naomi turned to Celeste. "Ms. Navarro, would you explain your role in contacting Ms. Hartwell?" Celeste nodded. She looked at me once, asking permission without words. I gave her a tiny incline of my head. After Ms. Hartwell was sentenced, Celeste said, Daniel promoted me. I thought it meant he trusted me. Then 6 months later, I found a draft separation package on his desk addressed to me, with clawback clauses for misconduct I hadn't committed. At first I assumed it was a template. Then I found the same shell accounts used in Ms. Hartwell's case tied to documents under my login. He was building another exit ramp. Daniel laughed incredulously. That's what this is. You're angry I was moving you out. Celeste's eyes moved to him. They had gone almost cold. No. I'm angry because my brother spent a year waking up screaming from a convoy breach your company buried, and the man who put me at that table expected I would stay useful forever. Third fracture. Clean and deep. Naomi asked, how did you reach Ms. Hartwell? Through a prison reentry legal clinic in Baltimore that forwarded letters after release. I wrote her because I found the archived server logs, and because if Daniel had done to me what he did to her, I knew I'd deserve it if I stayed silent. It was the closest thing to an apology she had ever offered me, and it was enough because it cost her something. Daniel's lawyer pushed back his chair. We need a caucus. Naomi checked her watch. You have 12 minutes. People rose all at once. Leather scraped. Water glasses rattled. Victoria hissed at Daniel before they'd even reached the corner. Edward barked something low and furious. General Vale remained seated, staring out at the windows where rain tracked down the glass in narrow silver threads. I stayed where I was. Naomi walked to the windows and stood beside me. How's your pulse? Steady. Good. Across the room, Celeste set both hands on the back of a chair and lowered her head briefly. Not crying. Just bracing. I crossed to her. She straightened when she sensed me. For a second we simply looked at each other, two women connected by the same man in different seasons of his cruelty. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she said. I know. I was not with him when you were sentenced, she said quickly as if the precision mattered. Not yet. But I knew enough about him by then that I should have asked better questions. I considered that. You're asking them now. She let out a breath. Do you hate me? Once I would have answered with pain. Now I answered with fact. I don't have the room for that anymore. Something in her shoulders loosened. When the Whitmores returned 12 minutes later, the family arrangement was gone. Daniel sat apart from Edward. Victoria chose the seat nearest her lawyer. Edward remained at the head because some instincts survive even while collapsing. General Vale had moved his chair slightly closer to Naomi's side without seeming to notice he'd done it. Naomi resumed. Have you reached a preliminary position? Daniel spoke first. Without admitting criminal exposure, my client is willing to discuss support for a vacatur motion conditioned on confidentiality. Naomi smiled without warmth. No. Edward said, be realistic. I am. Victoria leaned forward. No family in Washington survives public scandal of this scale. I looked at her. That sounds like a confession wrapped in etiquette. Her eyes flashed. Naomi clicked once more. The screen shifted to a final slide. Contingent release package prepared for 2 p.m. recipients. Department of Justice, Department of Defense, OIG, Major National Outlets, Procurement Oversight Committees, Wrongful Conviction Organizations, Veterans Casualty Review Board. Then a final line beneath it. Media hold expires absent signed cooperation by 1:30 p.m. Daniel's face went flat. You'd burn all of it. No, I said quietly. You built it out of dry timber. I'm just done pretending not to smell smoke. Edward stared at me with naked contempt now. You think destruction is power. I held his gaze. No. Memory is. Naomi folded her hands. You have 51 minutes. This time the room didn't explode. It splintered. Victoria turned on General Vale first. You weak, pathetic man. If you had kept your spine. Vale cut her off. Do not talk to me about spine. Edward rounded on Daniel. You used private channels for this. Daniel snapped back. Because you told me not to put anything on corporate servers. Celeste shut her eyes. Naomi murmured to the reporter, please read that last exchange back. The poor man did, each word clicking into the room like nails dropped on stone. Daniel swore. His lawyer whispered furiously in his ear. Edward's counsel began writing on a yellow pad with such force the pen nearly tore it. Victoria looked from one face to another and seemed, for the first time in her life, to understand that status cannot actually command reality. It can only delay it. At 1:07 p.m., General Vale asked for a separate statement on the record. He removed a folded sheet from his jacket pocket, opened it with both hands and read in a voice scraped raw by the night behind him. I affirm that Evelyn Hartwell's March 11th memo raised legitimate safety concerns that warranted escalation. I affirm that I participated in a March 17th discussion in which reputational containment was prioritized over proper inquiry. I affirm that I later signed a statement implying loss of confidence in Ms. Hartwell's professional integrity without direct evidence sufficient to support that implication. I affirm that this failure contributed materially to her prosecution and to the suppression of concerns related to Contract W4471. Victoria whispered, Adrian, stop. He kept reading. I submit this statement voluntarily and will cooperate with investigators. When he finished, the room was so quiet I could hear the HVAC vent above us. Daniel looked at him as if betrayal had just been invented. I almost laughed. Men like Daniel always think the people who help them do wrong are loyal. They're not loyal. They're just untested. That was when Edward Whitmore made his last real attempt to salvage the old world. He turned to me directly for the first time all day. Evelyn, he said, shifting into the tone he used for foundations and funeral podiums, what happened to you was regrettable. But scorched earth vindication helps no one. Think carefully. You release this, the headlines will drag your name through every detail again. Your prison record. Your plea. Your marriage. You won't control any of it. You wanted fear. Public women are trained on fear the way soldiers are trained on drills. I leaned back in my chair. I lost control of my name when I trusted yours. His face hardened. Naomi slid the settlement framework across the table. Here are the operative terms. For the next hour the room became a machine. Pauses. Addenda. Language around admissions. Scope of cooperation. Preservation obligations. Funding of an independent review. Support for vacator. Immediate escrow of settlement funds. Employment non-disparagement. A structured public statement acknowledging wrongful prosecution without forcing me to take another plea-shaped euphemism. Daniel fought hardest on the admissions. Edward fought hardest on money. Victoria fought hardest on wording, because women like her understand the violence of vocabulary. General Vale signed first. The scratch of his pen across the paper sounded louder than it should have. Daniel was next to capitulate, though he tried to perform reluctance rather than defeat. His hand shook once before he anchored it. Edward signed with visible fury, his signature carving into the page as if pressure itself could make facts less true. Victoria held out longest. Naomi said nothing. I said nothing. The room watched her. At last she snatched the pen and signed in a fast angular scrawl. When it was done, Naomi collected the pages and handed copies to each party. That preserves the media hold until filing, she said. If any signatory breaches, the full package releases automatically. Daniel stared at the table. You planned all of this from a hotel basement. I stood. No, I said. I planned it from a prison bunk. He flinched like the words had weight. As chairs shifted and counsel began gathering papers, I put on my coat. The rain had stopped. Late light broke across the windows in thin gold strips, turning the city beyond into glass and fire. Victoria rose too, unable to let a room end without reclaiming some part of it. You think this makes you one of us again? I turned to her. I spent years trying not to become anything like you, I said. Today I finally stopped worrying. Then I looked at Daniel, and because he had always cared more about tone than substance, I gave him the gentlest line of all. You were right about one thing, I said. People do have to live with what they sign. I left them there under the gleam of walnut and brass, surrounded by the papers that would unmake them. 6 months later, I woke to sunlight pooling across pale oak floors and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen of my own apartment. It was a corner unit in Old Town with tall windows, a narrow balcony, and a view of the river if you leaned slightly past the potted rosemary by the railing. Nothing about it was flashy. The countertops were honed quartz. The cabinets were painted a soft gray-green. The mug in my hand had a tiny chip near the rim because I'd bought it at a second-hand shop and liked that someone else had failed to break it completely. In the mornings, light moved across the dining table in slow gold rectangles, and sometimes I would stand there barefoot in silence just to let the ordinary settle over me. Fresh starts are rarely dramatic. They sound like a kettle. They feel like clean sheets. They taste like coffee you didn't have to rush. My conviction was vacated 83 days after the Bell-Sloan meeting. The order came down on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in Naomi's office reviewing draft materials for a procurement ethics workshop we were building together. She slid the printed order across the desk without a speech. I read the words once. Then twice. Then I put the paper down and stared at the grain of the wood because if I looked at her I might actually cry, and I was not in the habit of wasting mascara on legal triumph. Naomi waited exactly 10 seconds before saying, "If you pass out, do it away from the ficus." I laughed until I couldn't breathe. The karmic catalog, as Celeste later called it over drinks, unfolded with the beautiful methodical cruelty of consequences arriving on schedule. Daniel lost his law license first. Not permanently at the beginning. Suspension pending findings. Then the findings got worse. Fabrication. Suction. Misrepresentation in connection with federal proceedings. By the time the bar hearings concluded, his name had become a cautionary paragraph in professional ethics bulletins circulated to every ambitious associate in the city. His old confidence didn't survive public scrutiny. He still dressed well, still cut a handsome figure walking into hearing rooms under washed-out camera flashes, but the old sheen was gone. The world no longer mistook poise for innocence. He tried boutique consulting for a while, then strategic advisory, then disappeared behind one of those vague titles disgraced men invent when no serious institution will claim them. Victoria lost slower and more publicly, which suited the scale of her vanity. She was asked to resign from the Whitmore Veterans Foundation first, then from the Symphony Board, then from the Museum Gala Committee. Society women who had smiled beside her for decades suddenly developed scheduling conflicts. Invitations thinned. Her photograph vanished from event pages. A columnist who used to quote her on philanthropy wrote an exquisitely savage piece about performance benevolence and the women who weaponized charm to launder family power. Victoria sued. Then withdrew the suit when discovery threatened to turn her humiliation into an archive. Edward Whitmore lost the language of legacy. Shareholders at Whitmore Aerodyne filed derivative actions. The independent review found document suppression, unsafe substitutions and retaliatory practices far beyond my case. Defense committees that once returned his calls in minutes began issuing carefully distanced statements about oversight and accountability. He stepped down from 2 advisory councils. Then 3. Men like Edward never imagine dying socially before they die physically, but prestige is a fragile cathedral. Remove enough beams and it becomes echo. General Adrian Vale's fall was more complicated and in some ways more human. He was publicly censured, forced into retirement from consulting roles, and compelled to testify before an oversight panel where every clipped answer sounded like an apology trying not to say its own name. Some veterans called him a traitor. Others called him a coward. Both were right in their own directions. He sent me one letter, handwritten on heavy cream paper, no return address beyond a post office box. It contained no excuses. Only this: I confused institutional embarrassment with national interest and your life paid the difference. I never answered. I kept the letter in a file marked late truths. Colin Reeves was terminated from the Halcyon Grand within 48 hours of the kitchen video surfacing in the internal investigation. Denise Fallon, Victoria's assistant, cooperated early enough to avoid the worst outcomes, though her social disappearance was nearly total. Lawrence Pike, the fixer behind Meridian Response Solutions, took a plea on wire fraud and obstruction. The prosecutor who had leaned on my case to notch a national security-adjacent conviction retired unexpectedly 3 months after an internal review began. Washington has its own methods of burying embarrassment. Some people get prison. Some get consultancy. Some get to vanish with benefits and a carefully phrased statement about time with family. I noticed. I also kept my energy for the people I could actually drag into sunlight. The messages began almost immediately. Daniel texted first. I made mistakes. We both know that. This is getting out of hand. Call me. Then. You're letting Belle poison this. You know I loved you in my own way. That one sat in my notifications for half a day before I archived it. Loved you in my own way. As if cruelty became nuanced if phrased gently enough. Victoria left voicemails. Evelyn, whatever happened between adults, there were still private family matters involved. Then later, sharper, you are humiliating people who welcomed you. And once, surprisingly soft after the foundation formally cut ties. The family isn't the same. No, I thought. Finally looks like itself. Edward did not message. Men like him outsource emotion and call it dignity. General Vale never contacted me again beyond the letter. Celeste received the worst of it for a while. Daniel called her names I won't repeat because vulgarity gets boring when it's frightened. Victoria accused her of seduction, treachery, ambition, class resentment, ingratitude, and female spite, as if she were flipping through a cabinet of old labels and hoping one still adhered. Celeste saved every message in a folder she named Taxonomy of Cowardice. She showed it to me over lunch one day and we laughed so hard the waiter had to come back twice for our order. That friendship was not immediate. People want clean redemption arcs because they are easier to narrate than reality. Reality is slower. It is 2 women sitting across from each other in a quiet restaurant with brushed brass lamps and linen napkins, acknowledging the fact that one of them once loved the man who had ruined the other. It is honesty without melodrama. It is discovering that the humiliation you thought was uniquely yours was actually his preferred instrument. It is choosing not to let him define the geometry of every future room. 6 weeks after the vacator order, Celeste came to my apartment carrying a lemon tart from a bakery in DuPont and a bottle of Prosecco. We stood barefoot in my kitchen while evening light turned the cabinet handles warm gold. To administrative collapse, she said, lifting her glass. I touched mine to hers. To documentation. After the settlement funds cleared, I could have disappeared. Some people expected me to buy quiet. Move somewhere anonymous. Start over in a way that required no witness. But surviving a thing changes your eyesight. I couldn't go back to compliance work as if it were just policy grids and audit trails. I had seen too clearly what happened to truth when it had no advocate. So Naomi and I built Hartwell Bell Advisory. At first it was just a borrowed conference room, a refurbished website and 2 folding banker's boxes full of intake forms. We focused on procurement ethics, retaliation defense and wrongful termination cases for employees who had been punished for refusing to sign what should not be signed. Then the work widened. Reentry hiring consultations. Institutional review audits. Training modules on evidence preservation. We partnered with a nonprofit legal clinic to create a fellowship for women leaving prison with administrative, compliance, or paralegal skills no employer wanted to see past the record attached to them. Turns out women who have survived bureaucratic violence become very good at spotting it in advance. Our first major client was a hospital procurement officer in Baltimore who had been sidelined after flagging contaminated supplies. She sat in my office, hands twisting in her lap, and said, "I feel like I'm losing my mind." I said, "No. You're losing the version of reality they need you to accept." That became the work. On Thursdays I mentored 2 formerly incarcerated women from the fellowship. One had done 8 years and could rip apart a contract faster than most junior associates in town. The other had been turned down by 19 employers before we hired her to help build case chronologies. Watching them settle into competence felt better than any revenge fantasy I ever entertained in a prison bunk. Some consequences arrived as casual updates which made them sweeter. One crisp October morning, Naomi and I were walking back from a coffee run, paper cups warming our hands against the wind off the river, when she said almost as an afterthought, "You won't believe who I just saw outside the federal building." I glanced at her. "Who?" "Daniel. No tie. Carrying his own briefcase." I laughed. "How brave." She smiled into her coffee. "He asked if you were happy." "What did you say?" "That I bill for emotional intelligence now." Another time Celeste called on a Sunday while I was repotting basil on the balcony. "Have you heard?" she said, sounding almost guilty about how pleased she was. "Victoria got seated behind a hedge at the Penfield fundraiser." I leaned against the railing. A literal hedge. A very decorative one. Cruel. Poetic. There were darker updates too. One of the families from the convoy deaths reached a settlement with Whitmore Aerodyne after the independent review surfaced. I read their statement alone at my kitchen table and sat very still afterward. Not every justice arc is personal. Some belong to people who never knew your name and still live downstream from your silence. That mattered to me. It still does. I never answered Daniel. Not once. There is a particular freedom in no reply. It denies theater. It starves revisionism. Lets the facts stand there by themselves in daylight. The winter after everything broke, snow dusted the balcony railings and softened the city noise into something almost tender. Mrs. Donnelly, my former landlady, sent me a Christmas card with a note inside that read, "Always knew there was more to the story than those shoes." I laughed for a solid minute trying to understand which shoes she meant. In spring, the first anniversary of my release arrived quietly. No speeches. No commemorative grief. I took the day off and rode the ferry with a paperback I barely read, letting the river wind sting my cheeks while sunlight flashed off the water like cut metal. At some point I realized I had gone an entire morning without thinking about prison first. That was when I knew healing was no longer a project. It had become a habit. That evening I got one last message from Daniel. "I miss who we were before all this." I looked at the screen for a long time. Then I archived it next to the others and turned my phone face down. Because what he missed was not who we were. He missed who I had been willing to be for him. There is a difference vast enough to build a life inside. By the second summer, Hartwell Bell had moved into a proper office with glass partitions, matte black fixtures, and a waiting area furnished in practical wool and warm wood instead of the sterile chrome I used to associate with corporate seriousness. I wanted clients to feel steadied when they walked in, not intimidated. On one wall we hung framed prints of old patent diagrams and handwritten legal notes from women reformers whose names most people didn't know. History, if arranged properly, can feel like backup. Celeste joined us as Director of Investigations. The first day her name went on the website, she stood in my doorway holding 2 coffees and said, This is either the healthiest development of my adult life or the most expensive atonement arc in North America. Why choose? I said. He grinned. People still asked sometimes, usually with a certain hunger in their voice, whether I hated her. They wanted the old story. Wife and mistress. Betrayal sharpened into permanent female hostility because it's easier for audiences to process than structural manipulation. I would tell them the truth when I felt like being generous. Daniel had lied differently to each of us, and neither one of us owed him lifelong centrality. That usually disappointed them. I didn't mind. One Friday in late August we were on the office terrace at sunset, the city washed in orange and rose, when Celeste handed me a slim envelope. What's this? Open it. Inside was a photograph. Not of Daniel. Not of a courtroom. It was a still from the grainy old kitchen video at the Halcyon, frozen on the moment just after General Vale had recognized me. My apron was half untied. Victoria's mouth was open. Colin looked sick. Daniel's face had gone flat. And I was standing there with one hand at my side, calm as winter. I got it from Discovery Archive footage, Celeste said. Thought you should have the exact moment they realized you weren't prey. I studied the photograph. The fluorescent light made everything look severe. Stainless steel. White tile. Broken glass on the floor near Vale's shoes. The scene that had once felt like impact now looked like evidence of transformation already underway. Thank you, I said. Frame it or burn it, she said. Either way, it's yours. I framed it. Not in my living room. I'm not sentimental enough for that. I put it in my office near the bookshelf, slightly turned so clients notice it only after we've already been talking a while. Some ask about it. Some don't. For me it isn't a trophy. It's a map marker. Here. This is where the story stopped happening to you and started happening through you. That evening after everyone left, I stayed on the terrace alone. The sun was lowering behind the city in a wide orange wash, gilding the glass towers and the river until everything looked briefly molten. Warm air moved the leaves of the potted olive tree Naomi insisted made us look international but fiscally sane. Traffic below softened into a distant hush. One by one, office windows around us winked into evening reflection. There are hours at the end of certain days when the world seems to loosen its grip on performance, and you can feel who you are without anyone telling you. I heard the terrace door open behind me. It was Celeste carrying 2 small tumblers and a bottle of sparkling water. She poured and handed me a glass. The bubbles caught the sunset like tiny sequins. For a moment we stood shoulder to shoulder in companionable silence, looking out over the slow ignition of city lights. A year earlier, if someone had told me one of the gentlest evenings of my life would be spent on a terrace with the woman who once sat beside my husband at donor dinners, I would have laughed in their face. Life has no obligation to respect the neat categories pain creates at the beginning. Sometimes the person from the other side is just someone else who survived the same machine from a different angle. Celeste lifted her glass. To women who read the metadata. I touched mine to hers. To never leaving our laptops unlocked again. She laughed, the sound light and unguarded, and for a second the whole city seemed to exhale with us. After she left, I stayed a little longer. The last of the sun laid a burnished stripe across the terrace floorboards, and the sky faded from amber to violet over the water. I thought about the woman I had been before all this. Not weak. Never weak. But trusting in ways that now seemed almost luxurious. I believed institutions once shown the truth would correct themselves. I believed love and admiration were close enough to rely on. I believed being indispensable at work made you safe. I believed documented excellence protected women from men with softer hands and dirtier motives. That woman wasn't foolish. Just uninitiated. The woman I became is quieter. Harder in the right places. Kinder in more selective ones. She knows the difference between forgiveness and access. She knows composure can be a blade if you hold it correctly. She knows survival is not the highest form of justice if you can build something larger from it. And she knows that some people enter your life not to stay, not even to teach, but to reveal exactly what you must stop tolerating in order to become yourself. I don't bless the Whitmores. I don't romanticize what they did. There are nights even now when a certain tone of voice or the smell of industrial soap can throw me backward for a breath. Trauma doesn't vanish because paperwork finally catches up. But I do, in the privacy of my own mind, thank them for one thing. They forced me to meet the part of myself that would never bow again. Without Daniel's polished cruelty, I might have gone on mistaking accommodation for wisdom. Without Victoria's contempt, I might never have understood how much power women surrender trying to be accepted by those who despise them. Without Edward's legacy machine, I might never have learned how institutions dress cowardice in formal language. Without General Vale's failure, I might never have grasped how dangerous convenience becomes when men call it duty. And without prison, brutal and stripping and unforgiving as it was, I might never have met the women who taught me that dignity does not depend on who believes you first. The city lights brightened below, scattered across the river like coins dropped into dark velvet. I raised my glass toward the last ember of sunset and let myself feel it all at once. The old grief, the earned peace, the weight of the name I had taken back, the improbable tenderness of standing in a life I built from wreckage. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about making them suffer. It's about becoming someone their betrayal can no longer define. I stood there until the sky went fully deep and the windows around me turned into mirrors. And when I finally went inside carrying my empty glass and my quiet, I thought it again a little differently, just to hear how true it sounded in the dark. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying what hurt you. It's about building a life so steady, so honest, and so fully your own that the people who tried to ruin you are reduced to a chapter while you remain the whole story.